Picture this: a lawyer armed not just with the law, but a camera, standing firm in the face of authority. It all begins when an officer stops him without a clear reason, demanding identification. Instead of backing down, our protagonist calmly challenges the officer, questioning their understanding of the law. The tension rises as the cop grows visibly frustrated, but the lawyer doesn't falter. With every response, he expertly dismantles the officer's misconceptions, standing his ground while keeping his cool. What unfolds next is both gripping and eye-opening, a battle of rights versus ignorance. You'll witness how knowledge and confidence can shift the balance of power in an unexpected encounter. Will the officer realize their mistake and back off, or will this standoff escalate further? Stay tuned, because this story is about to show you the true meaning of standing up for your rights. The lawyer, a seasoned professional, had encountered situations like this before. He knew the rules inside and out, but not everyone around him shared that same knowledge. The officer, on the other hand, seemed to operate more on assumption than understanding. With a hint of impatience, the officer demanded that the lawyer provide ID, citing a vague reason of suspicion. The lawyer, calm yet assertive, knew that refusal to show ID wasn't a crime unless specific circumstances were met. As the conversation escalated, the officer's tone shifted from polite to confrontational, as if trying to force the lawyer into compliance. It was clear the cop didn't expect this level of pushback. The lawyer's responses were precise and calculated, revealing his deep understanding of citizens' rights. But with every word, the officer seemed to dig in deeper, unwilling to admit his potential misstep. Would this standoff come to an end, or was there more to come? The standoff between the lawyer and the officer was growing tenser with each passing minute. The officer's jaw clenched as he repeated his demand for identification, but the lawyer stood firm, calmly explaining that he was under no legal obligation to provide it without a valid reason. He could feel the officer's frustration mounting, and the pressure was palpable. Around them, bystanders were starting to gather, sensing something unusual was happening. They watched in silence, some clearly siding with the officer, while others appeared intrigued by the lawyer's calm demeanor. What neither of them expected was the silent game of power that was unfolding. The officer, caught in a moment of pride and authority, was not about to let the lawyer walk away with the upper hand. Meanwhile, the lawyer was calculating his every move, knowing that one wrong step could escalate things to a whole new level. As the lawyer spoke, he kept his cool, but there was a hint of doubt in his mind. Would his knowledge of the law be enough to defuse the situation, or would the officer refuse to back down? The uncertainty loomed, and the tension in the air grew thicker by the second. The air was thick with tension now, the weight of each word hanging in the space between them. The officer took a step closer, his voice now sharper, demanding the lawyer's identification once again. The crowd, once quiet, started murmuring, eyes flicking between the two men, sensing the growing conflict. The lawyer stood his ground, his gaze unwavering. He calmly repeated his rights, speaking with such authority that the officer seemed momentarily unsure of how to proceed. But the officer wasn't backing down, and it was clear he wouldn't let the situation slide without asserting his control. In that moment, something shifted in the officer's posture, something that said he was no longer interested in conversation. The lawyer noticed it immediately, a subtle shift from authority to something more personal. The officer's hands twitched as if he was preparing to escalate. The lawyer's heart raced, but he knew he had to remain composed. As the minutes ticked by, the lawyer could feel the officer's frustration nearing its peak. The officer began to circle, his eyes never leaving the lawyer, trying to outmaneuver him with intimidation. Each move felt calculated, but it was clear the officer was unraveling. He reached for his radio, his fingers trembling ever so slightly, as if calling for backup. The lawyer could sense the officer was on the edge, and the moment of truth was fast approaching. Would the officer call for help, making this an even bigger showdown? Or would the lawyer's knowledge of his rights be enough to break the officer's will? The crowd was watching closely now, the silence almost deafening, as both men stood at the precipice of what could be a major turning point. The tension was unbearable. Just as the officer's hand hovered near his radio, the unexpected happened. A second officer, seemingly out of nowhere, appeared on the scene. He walked briskly toward the first officer, his expression unreadable. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, sensing that something was about to shift. The second officer didn't immediately speak to the lawyer. Instead, he glanced at the situation with an air of authority, as if assessing the situation from a distance. The first officer, visibly rattled, seemed to be explaining the situation under his breath, but the second officer's gaze never left the lawyer. A chill ran down the lawyer's spine. This wasn't just a simple standoff anymore. With the arrival of the second officer, the stakes had been raised. Now it wasn't just one officer trying to assert his control. There was an unspoken tension between them, like a silent power struggle unfolding in real time. Was the second officer there to back up the first, or was he there to keep an eye on how things were escalating? The lawyer stood his ground, but now he had to wonder, what was the second officer's role in all of this? Had the situation just shifted into something far more dangerous? The atmosphere grew more charged, the clock ticking louder with every second. The audience's anticipation reached a boiling point. Would this new arrival help the first officer regain control, or would the lawyer's rights now be questioned even more severely? The uncertainty hung in the air like a storm, ready to break. The air grew thick as the second officer finally spoke, his voice calm but firm. "What's going on here?" he asked, his eyes flicking between the lawyer and his partner. The first officer hesitated for a moment, clearly unsure of how to explain the situation. The lawyer seized the opportunity, his voice steady as he spoke up, outlining his rights once again. "I'm not required to show identification unless there's reasonable suspicion or a law that says otherwise. You don't have that." The second officer nodded slowly, seemingly processing the situation. The first officer, however, was visibly frustrated, his grip tightening on his radio. The tension in the air was palpable as the second officer turned his attention to the first. "Let's take a step back," he said, his tone authoritative but not aggressive. "We don't want this escalating unnecessarily." The first officer clenched his fists but said nothing. The crowd watched in stunned silence, waiting for what would happen next. After a long, excruciating moment, the first officer finally relented. He took a step back, radio still in hand, but no longer moving toward the lawyer. The second officer turned to the lawyer, his expression softer, almost apologetic. "You're free to go." Just as the lawyer began to breathe a sigh of relief, a voice cut through the air, sharp and unexpected. A third officer, hidden behind a nearby patrol car, stepped forward. "That's not how this works," he said, his voice cold and commanding. The crowd froze. The second officer's face turned pale, and the first officer quickly took a step back. The lawyer's heart skipped a beat. What now? The unexpected arrival of the third officer threatened to undo everything. The stakes had just been raised again, and the tension was now higher than ever. The crowd held its breath as the third officer stepped closer, his presence looming over the scene. But before he could make another move, the second officer raised a hand, signaling him to stop. With a tense glance, the second officer turned to the lawyer and, in a calm but firm voice, explained, "We've got this. You're right, and we're not here to escalate things." The third officer hesitated, his expression darkening, but the tension in the air seemed to dissipate. Slowly, the officers backed off, and the lawyer, though still on edge, took a deep breath. With a nod, he turned and walked away, his rights upheld in the face of authority. As the scene concluded, the crowd began to disperse, but the message was clear. Standing up for your rights can change the course of an interaction, no matter how intimidating it may seem. The officer's missteps, the lawyer's unwavering stance. Today, knowledge of the law was the real winner.